Good afternoon. I've heard this a lot. Genesis is defective. It has contradictory accounts between Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. Differences in style, they say, between Genesis chapter 1 and 2 demand different authors, has conflicting accounts, and the conclusion is that the Bible is not reliable. But the differences in style and the difference in conflicting accounts, they aren't conflicting, they aren't different authors. This conclusion doesn't demand that the Bible is not reliable. Here's my explanation. Let's read it together. Critics of God's Word advance their criticism of the Bible by making the grand assumption with no substantive evidence that there were a number of writers, compilers of the book of Genesis, who did not intend to make sense with what they arrived at despite contradictions, which the critics allege are evident. So the critics claim that the writers, compilers circulated their work without any effort to reconcile anything. Critics maintain that this permitted what the critics view as irreconcilable contradictions, especially throughout Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And these alleged irreconcilable contradictions could then be used to openly refute God's Word without any viable defense whatsoever. However, this alleged problem with the Bible's reliability is resolved with an honest, objective reading of Genesis chapters 1 and 2, strictly in accordance with the normative rules of language, context, and logic. You can check it right here to see what those rules are. But it's simply reading rules that we learned in school. For an honest reading of God's Word reveals a wholly reliable, consistent meaning that completely upholds itself as reliable, without contradiction, error, or loose ends. And all the while, an honest reading of God's Word completely refutes what the critics have continually claimed against the Bible, such as what they assert Genesis chapters 1 and 2 convey that is contradictory. So the problem lies not with the words of God's Word, but with how the critics or anyone interprets those words. The context of Genesis chapter 1 is panoramic and broad. The context of Genesis chapter 2 is a close-up view of a person in a particular time frame which was presented in Genesis chapter 1, namely the sixth day of creation and the man whom Jehovah God created, Adam. And this view includes minutiae details such as the names and locations of 4 river tributaries, a specific garden which God planted and then placed into it the man he had formed, the fact that Adam needed a mate, the naming of specific animals and birds. The critics incorrectly assume that both chapters attempt to present the same events, but use different styles to do this. If I were to write both events, I would have to change my style, and I'm one person. So, the last paragraph here. The critics claim that the style of chapter 1 is in stereotype, measured and precise, with recurring formulae, such as the repetitive use of the verb to create, and that's correct. This is because the subject matter and perspective of chapter 1 is more stereotype, measured, and precise, with recurring formulae, such as the repetitive style of the verb to create. And since chapter 2's subject matter and focus is more diversified and picturesque, a more diversified picturesque style without recurring formulae would be the most appropriate style for Moses to use. Another writer would not be needed to write chapter 2 because of the different style. God just simply inspired Moses to utilize the appropriate style to correspond to changes in the context. It's all about context. Most accomplished writers do this today when the context dictates it. We do this in conversation. Refer to a local newspaper, a favorite novel, even a history book. On the other hand, many of the other claims of the critics, such as chapter 2, let me move it back up, is notably fresher and more spontaneous and primitive as compared to chapter 1. Those are imaginary. Only in one's imagination could a claim to be substantiated that chapter 1 is not spontaneous or fresh or primitive. One could be more spontaneous, primitive, and fresh than chapter 1 of Genesis 1, which begins, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Then God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light," and so on. These style differences have no weight as an argument and simply reflect changes in subject matter. In point 2, critics claim that anthropomorphic references to God described as exemplifying human behaviorisms in Genesis 2, who fashions, breathes, plans, takes, sets, brings, closes up, builds, walks, contradicts the God of Genesis chapter 1. But the critics have quite a superficial argument. Man in his finite mind cannot express ideas about God in anything but through anthropomorphisms. Furthermore, chapter 1 of Genesis also expresses God in such equally anthropomorphic terms as called, saw, blessed, deliberated. Verse 26, let us make. God worked for 6 days, then rested. Chapter 2's lack of a reference to man being created in the image of God contradicts chapter 1, they say. But the critics assumed beforehand that chapters 1 and 2 are two separate accounts of the overall creation process, which someone attempted to hook together. They ignore the simplest and most obvious interpretation that chapter 2 is just a continuation of chapter 1 by the same author, providing more detail in a narrower and more focused area of what chapter 1 has already presented, from a panoramic to a close-up and detailed account. The narrower and close focus often demand a change in verb tenses and person and more details, but without having to replicate details covered. A change of authors is not needed to be made to do this. If this is the case, and it is, that a change is not needed, then chapter 2, being a continuation of what was already stated in chapter 1, does not need to repeat what was just stated in chapter 1 relative to such things like man being created in the image of God. Shall we rest our case?